I'm going to give a formal introduction, but let me give you some house rules just so that we get started. We can kind of maybe get in sync and align ourselves with some of the things that, we need to consider in every virtual format. One of the first things that, we want to do always is be respectful, just in terms of, how we engage on this platform or any platform really. So, house rule number one is, of course, your questions are always welcome. And we'd like to, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that'll work, but just in terms of, the way in which we dialogue and discourse with each other, just the utmost respect in terms of that. Also, rule number two, please, if you could mute yourselves, make sure that you are muted. We also have the ability to mute people if there's a situation in which the mic comes on. So if you can just take a minute and make sure that your mic is muted, we would be very, very grateful. And also cameras. I'm going to be turning mine off when the presenter comes on, but if we could have all cameras off just for the presenters. And so just to make sure that, we focus in on the really important information that they're providing. Also, we have the ability in Teams to run an attendance sheet. So your professors, students that came tonight, your professors will have an opportunity to give you those points, and I can run that sheet and provide that sheet to all of our instructors that are here tonight. I will also midway through and maybe some way through remind ourselves, those that are coming in and maybe leaving, put that in the chat as well. Your attendance is important and we will give you points in relation to that. Also, let's also consider that, we want to have questions at the end of the presentation. And so what we thought might be best is that, if you have a question, if you put it in the chat, we can address all of those questions at the end, just so we have some kind of seamless flow within the presentations. And, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Those are the house rules, and we appreciate, first of all, you coming. So thank you for coming tonight. The Government Discipline would really formally love to welcome you to this presentation. This is one presentation of many of a series on building El Paso strong that got started right after the situation that occurred, the tragic situation that occurred at Walmart in 2019. So this is tonight part of a larger series that has been done and has been ongoing. But tonight is a really special night because, as all of us have been paying attention for the last month or so, 30 days, I know that we may not feel the press of all that is occurring in the world, but the world is changing. And so we had an opportunity tonight to be able to sit with some of our experts in the field and listen to them in terms of Ukraine. And so I would like to formally welcome you tonight to talking a little bit about the war in Ukraine and the consequences for the world. We have three presenters tonight, and let me formally introduce them to you, and then you'll get a chance to hear from all of them. Our first presenter tonight is one of our instructors, our lecturer, James Stepp. And he'll be presenting. He'll be our first presenter. Our second presenter will be Dr. Sergio Sainz Rivera, and he'll be talking to us, and I'll formally introduce his, right after James is done, I'll formally introduce his title. And our third presenter tonight is also part of our government family and faculty, Dr. Young Park. And so we have three presenters, and the goal tonight is to start, of course, we did start on time, but to get through till about 7:30. So we have 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for each presenter. And then, of course, at the end, again, your questions are always valuable, welcomed, and we are so grateful that you're here tonight. Okay, so let me go ahead and introduce James Stepp and a little bit about his title, and then we can get started. Again, just the cameras off, please, as well as the microphones, except for James, and I'll go ahead and turn mine off. So Instructor Stepp is talking tonight about the politics of Ukraine, conflict, and in perspective and explanation. So James, we are excited to hear from you tonight, and thank you for taking the time to put this presentation together and sharing your knowledge with us. And I'll go let you take it from there.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen here.
should be okay. I'm going to assume everybody can see. So my job today is going to be trying to give you a little bit of a background information on the conflict, the origins of Ukraine and Russia, and to try and set up essentially the following presentations, which are more focused on international relations theory. So first things first, where did Ukraine come from? Well, Ukraine was actually never an independent country prior to it achieving its independence in 1991. There were two brief exceptions to this rule, though. One was the civilization known as the Kievan Rus, which was Viking and Slavic civilization that arose in about the mid-9th century and lasted until the mid-14th century. It's important to note, especially because this conflict has three main actors, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that all three of these countries trace their origin back to the Kievan Rus. So this is going to come up again because President Putin released an essay to the Russian military, which goes into a lot of detail on these historical backgrounds, and we're going to go into it as time goes on. So, who were the Kievan Rus? Well, besides being a Viking and Slav kingdom, they were a loose confederation of petty fiefdoms. Basically, they consisted of what is now parts of Ukraine, Russia, Poland, and Estonia. And when looking at the Kievan Rus, you can see here that their capital is situated over here in Kiev. Of course, the Dnieper River here is going to be an important historical foundation when looking at Ukrainian history and Russian history, because they both trace their backgrounds to Kiev. So Kiev was a trade center. It wasn't the original capital of the Kievan Rus, but it did eventually earn that title. The Kievan Rus lasted until the 14th century, at which point they were broken up and eaten, essentially, by a number of empires. So you had, for example, the Khanate, the Mongols. You had eventually the Russian Empire under the Tsar, as well as some other countries like, for example, Poland and Lithuania, as well as the Ottoman Empire. So Ukraine starts off its history as a civilization surrounded by large empires and basically constantly under assault. So when Ukraine is broken up, when the Kievan Rus, I should say, is broken up in the 14th century, you have what in political science, one of the principles that we look at, one of the definitions that we look at is how civil society develops within a country. And when we look at Ukraine, what we actually see is that civil society had a very slow start, not just because the Kievan Rus ceased being an independent country in the 14th century, but even afterwards, after when Ukraine was partitioned by numerous empires, you didn't really see a civil society grow, with the exception of the Cossacks, who are known as they're a partially democratic military organization that popped up in the 16th century, and their main goal was to defend Crimea and Ukraine from Muslim, known as Tartar incursions. Okay, so we have the Ukraine, which by this period in time, has had its identity as a civilization basically suppressed. Ukrainian language, for example, was banned. Depending on which empire you found yourself in, if you were Ukrainian, you were basically forced to learn the language, whether it be Russian or Hungarian, Polish, so on and so forth. And so even the nobility in Ukraine faced a tough uphill battle when it came to creating a civil society, to working on Ukrainian independence. So it was actually Polish nobility that ruled over much of Ukraine. The Ukrainian nobles were not granted many rights, whether it be the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so on and so forth. So let's move up forward in time here. So we reach 1917, the 20th century, and this is going to be the second, essentially the second exception to the rule, where Ukraine is going to get a brief taste of independence. So in 1917, the National Republic of Ukraine is created. How does this come about? Well, basically you had of course, World War I was going on during this time, and the collapse of the Russian Empire with the Russian Civil War. So Ukraine, as well as many other smaller republics that made up the Russian Empire, decided during this time to try and pursue nationalism as much as possible. So you saw a revitalization of Ukrainian culture. You saw what was basically a mini renaissance in Ukraine during this time period. This would continue into the 1920s, and it wouldn't be until the 1930s where the Soviet Union fell under the control of Joseph Stalin, the infamous premier of the Soviet Union, who would use his power to try and bring the Cossacks in Ukraine under Soviet control. Basically, the Cossacks were not happy about having their farmland split up and Sovietized, communalized. And so you began to see really a strong Ukrainian nationalist movement based off of this opposition to Sovietization. Now, Joseph Stalin's reaction to this was the infamous Holodomor, essentially genocide, where from 1932 to 1933, Ukraine was forced to go through an artificial famine. So Ukrainian grain was confiscated directly from the farmers, taken to Soviet warehouses, and the Ukrainians were not allowed to essentially consume their own agricultural products. And so there are different estimates when it comes to how many people died in the Holodomor, anywhere from 4 to 10 million people. And it should be noted that this also affected people outside of Ukraine as well, because Ukraine has a history and an economic background as an agricultural breadbasket for much of Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, so we enter into the 1950s, and you have a new era in the Soviet Union. With the death of Joseph Stalin, you have a desire by the Soviet leadership to move away from some of Stalin's more brutal policies, and to basically try to, in a sense, make up for the Soviet Union's actions against Ukraine. So the Soviet Union granted Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. This was supported by Nikita Khrushchev, who, while an ethnic Russian and president of the Soviet Union, he did rule over Ukraine for a brief time period in his political career, so he had a soft spot for it. This is going to come up again when we look at Putin and his essay that we're going to look at in a few minutes here. So during this time period, you have much of the governance of Ukraine taking place in Moscow, and very little development in civil society. Even when it comes to religion, of course, the Soviet Union did make Orthodox Christianity, the main religion of Ukraine, illegal. But even prior to the Soviet Union, the Orthodox faith was closely tied with the various empires that controlled Ukraine, and it wasn't very independent from these political considerations. And so oftentimes even the Orthodox Church would support the various imperial conquerors of Ukraine. Okay, so fast forward, and we have the fall of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence, and this kicked off a number of negotiations. At the time, of course, you had, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, numerous republics, including countries like Poland, that were more than happy to break away from Soviet domination. In Ukraine, you had what was more of a top-down revolution, where the elites in Ukraine basically wanted to have more control over their country, and the average person was less than enthusiastic. You know, there definitely were celebrations and so on, but when looking at the actual independence of Ukraine and its development into a democracy, Ukraine was a little bit behind the other countries in the region at the time, especially countries like Poland. So one of the arguments that was brought up by President Putin was that basically the Soviet Union and later Russia were promised that NATO would not expand into the former Soviet Union. And a lot of these conversations actually took place regarding West Germany and East Germany's reunification after the Cold War. And there were various promises, verbal promises made by Western leaders, including Secretary of State Baker, President Bush, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, President of France Mitterrand, and so on. So these were verbal promises, but it's important to note that in this period of time, in this period of history, there was an almost utopianism that was breaking out across Europe and the United States. So these agreements were not made in, they were not actually written agreements, but there were numerous private promises that were passed between American and NATO and Soviet leaders. Much has been brought up about the Ukrainian nuclear weapons stockpile after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's important to note that Ukraine did not actually have control of really its military, let alone its nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union basically, while it did, of course, grant Ukraine the status of a independent Soviet republic, most decisions were made in Moscow. And so, as stated previously, a lot of the political conflict that's going to take place in the 90s is going to be the Ukrainian elite trying to exercise really authority for the first time in decades. Okay. Final note on the Ukrainians' nuclear weapon program. Ukraine did eventually give up its nuclear weapons. As stated previously, that they did not really have control of them, but they agreed to, they didn't have the launch codes, first of all, but they agreed to give them up to the Soviet Union, to Russia, sorry, as long as the United States and Russia agreed in the Budapest Memorandum to basically guarantee Ukraine's independence. So while Putin has talked a lot about verbal agreements that were made by Western leaders to Russia, there is an actual written legal agreement treaty between United States, Russia, and Ukraine, in which both the United States and Russia agree not to invade Ukraine and to ensure its independence. Okay, so looking at this new independent Ukraine, first thing to note is that the main conflict that's going to go on in Ukraine from the 90s up until today is really going to be whether Ukraine is going to ally itself and become more Western or stick to the Russian sphere of influence. So there were two major revolutions in the 2000s that revolved around this issue of Russia versus the EU, essentially. And so you have President Yankovic, who was the leader of the Party of Regions, the pro-Russian party. He actually would have to give up his presidency in 2005 due to massive voter fraud that was uncovered, but he would be back in 2010, where he would win the presidency, and despite promising to have a closer relationship with Europe, he would in fact bring Ukraine closer and closer to Moscow and Russia. When looking at the Maidan Revolution, which basically sets up this whole conflict that we are that essentially Ukraine is enduring to this day. The Maidan Revolution was a reaction to President Yankovic's dragging of his feet when it came to signing a memorandum of agreement with the European Union that would bring Ukraine closer to the EU. Because he basically did not sign this agreement, you had massive unrest and protests. The Ukrainian police would react with violence and try to put down the protests, but this would not be successful. And President Yankovic would eventually be forced to flee Ukraine to Russia in 2014. After Yankovic, you have President Poroshenko of the European Solidarity Party. President Poroshenko's party is basically or his former party was basically the pro-Western Ukrainian party. But it should be noted, yet again, that when it comes to the relationship between the Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and the EU, that it's much more complicated than just simply being a supporter of one political party or the other. President Poroshenko was, while he was successful in bringing the Ukraine closer to the EU, he ended up losing a lot of popularity because he was seen as too tough towards the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. The Maidan Revolution is, going back to the Maidan Revolution, it was very famous in that there was a lot of NGOs. Russia claimed that these non-governmental organizations, these Western organizations, basically were working with Western intelligence agencies. But while surely there was some collusion, there's not proof that this was in any way overriding of the democratic wishes of the people of Ukraine. So in 2014, as a result of President Yankovic fleeing Ukraine, Russia decides to seize Crimea. Crimea is the home of an important Russian naval base. And also Russia supports Ukrainian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk region in Ukraine. There were two agreements that were decided upon in order to put an end to this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Minsk Agreement 1 and 2. And to make a long story short, basically the Minsk Agreement called on Ukraine to give up a big part of its sovereignty as a national institution to the Donetsk and Luhansk states, and basically gave them permission to veto any closer ties to the European Union. And so that was not acceptable to Ukraine. President Zelensky of the Ukraine is quite an interesting background. He was an actor and a comedian. His fictional political party, known as the Servant of the People Party, was eventually made real. He originally ran as an independent in 2019, but as a result of his popularity, the Ukrainians went ahead and created a political party based off of his fictional party. So he ran on ending the war and fighting corruption. Experts aren't sure why he was able to beat the European Solidarity Party in such a dramatic fashion, but they believe that because he was not affiliated to traditional Ukrainian or Russian politics, and he was considered sort of an outsider, that helped. Okay, so let's briefly look at Putin, and I know I'm about running out of time here. So we all know that Putin has a background in the KGB. He came to power in Russia all the way back in 1999. He's one of the longest-serving leaders in the world. His background in the KGB and in other shady dealings in the post-Soviet period would earn him quite the reputation. It's important to note that in the 90s, Russia was basically broke, and it had very little in the way of prospects. And so Putin would eventually run for office on essentially make Russia great again, was his message. And so he was viewed as somebody who would stand up to the West and act as a counterbalance. So he's tried to position himself as the leader of the opposition to liberalism and the rules-based international order that the United States and NATO have brought about. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Putin's views and his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Basically, he believes Ukraine is a fake state, that basically it was a part of Russia or the Kievan Rus since the actual Kievan Rus civilization, and that because of throughout most of its history, Ukraine was a part of foreign empires, that basically it does not have legitimacy as a country. Furthermore, he's alleged that it's been Nazified by the West. Of course, as we all know, throwing around the term Nazi and fascist is quite popular in all in Western and Eastern politics nowadays. But there's very little evidence beyond essentially the Azov Battalion, which is part of the Ukrainian National Guard, for any neo-Nazism. It should be noted that even the United States has consistently had a problem with alleged extremism in its military ranks, as you know, came up in January on the January 6th. Okay, so Putin has basically a 19th/20th century realpolitik view of the world. He views Ukraine as part of Russia's sphere of influence, and he is willing to fight for it. When looking at his actions, both now and into the future, he's definitely dedicated a large part of his reputation to this invasion. He basically cannot back out now, and a lot of the actual military plans were supposedly, there's been speculation that it's been based on false information, that basically Putin was told that Ukraine was essentially calling out to be part of Russia. Okay, I know I probably went over a little bit of my time, but I have some sources here, some very interesting articles you can read, and these are the sources that I use for the latest news on Ukraine. I'll probably upload this presentation into the chat, but I would like to thank everybody for coming out today, or virtually coming out, and I'd like to turn it over. Okay, thank you.
No, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for this information. Our second presenter is ready, and Dr. Sergio Sainz Rivera is going to talk to us tonight. His title tonight is "Can International Relations Theories Predict the Outcome for the Conflict in Ukraine?" So I'll turn it over to Dr. Sergio Sainz Rivera, and ready to go.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it now?
Yes,
Can you
Doctor.
see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, all of you, to attend this late late meeting. I'm very happy to speak about it because one of my preoccupations with the war and the state of the world is precisely the ignorance about issues in the world. You know, everybody's concentrated on Will Smith while people are dying elsewhere, and I think it's a disservice to humanity, and one has to put their grain of salt in knowing that. The other day, it preoccupied me more when, you know, I was interviewed by Univision, and this very young reporter asked me all the items in Ukraine, right, about Russia, the strategic situation with the US, the place of Russia in the world, and all that. And the last question was, is El Paso a target for this war? What should we be worried? And I said, well, in the faraway event that we go to war and the faraway event that we ever use nuclear weapons, maybe Fort Bliss would be a target for sure, I told her. And instead of presenting my 15-minute talk on Ukraine, she made that the little piece, the 4 seconds that El Paso is a target in the nuclear war. So there's an example of there's so much disinformation, right? And so sometimes you gotta leave it to the experts sometimes. That's the difference between a political commentator and a political scientist, is that we use theories to explain the world. And theories are just systematic observations around the world to find conclusions, you know? Today, I'm gonna explain 3 theories of international relations. If you ever study IR, as we call it, international relations, IR, you would likely come across the 3 main theories, which is realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And in this case, I'm gonna not only explain the theory, but explain the predictive value of those theories to explain the war in Ukraine and maybe predict what's gonna happen. So the objective is predict. Theories help us navigate the waters better, more systematically, avoid misinformation, you know, and this is my objective tonight. Now, to begin my talk, one needs to know that in order to make policy or international relations, the states utilize at least 3 tools. The military tool, you build an army, right, to interact with others. That's the most ancient. You arm yourself and invade your neighbor to capture the next hunting ground, right? Now, the military tool has conventional and now modernly nuclear weapons. Conventional are those tanks, planes, submarines, boats, etc. But nuclear war is like an end game, like it's such a different type of weapon because it ends all weapons, right? That it's its own game now. It's its own tool, and very few actors have it and are willing to use it, right? The other tool that they use is the more modern and effective, which is trade and economic tools. You, instead of invading and fighting, you trade with the other neighbor, right? And you also can send your diplomats. It's the quietest thing, like from comical interactions, like here is Hillary Clinton, the photo with her equivalent, the Russian main diplomat. Hillary Clinton was our head diplomat in the Department of State and the Secretary of State, and here is with I don't remember his name, but together they're pressing a reset button in 2009, I believe, reset the relation with Russia, right? We're gonna be friends now. We've been together in a Cold War, in these horrible strategic situations during 50 years after communism, after World War II, but now we're gonna be friends because you're not communist anymore. So let's reset the button. We're ready for the future. We'll not admit Ukraine to NATO because NATO is the alliance against Russia, and Ukraine was part of Russia, and Ukraine is the closest thing to Russia to put nuclear weapons. So it's very important for Russia not to have nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right? Or that Europe does not include Ukraine. So how do we explain the strategic situation, right? I promise you to explain three theories: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Let's go with the first one. And I'm going to butcher and I'm going to reduce to a minimal expression the greatest intellectual tradition in international relations. We have a tradition since Thucydides and Machiavelli to explain that the states, the countries live in anarchy. What it means is there is no world government to protect them. There's no one that's going to save your country from an invasion. So what do you do if the world is a dangerous place and you are rational? Your actions have to be strategic and even moral, right? So you're going to arm yourself to the teeth. You're going to build a strong military, because at minimum, you're going to seek to survive. At maximum, if you can and want, right, you can conquer the world. Like this is the aspiration of Genghis Khan, and this is perhaps some accuse the United States of imperialism, world domination, Russia and China, right? So that's the simplest expression. The world is dangerous, so you arm yourself, right? Knowing that, if you are really preoccupied with the world being a dangerous place, you can do many things. Among them, you can find friends to help you, right? And the other is increase your military spending. The problem with international relations is that every time you do something to help yourself, you threaten the other. Let's say I get a gun and I bring it to the classroom. Are you going to feel more safe or are you going to feel more threatened, right? So that creates a security dilemma because you don't know if the gun is there to threaten you or to help you. So every time the United States acquires another bomb or increases military spending or expands the alliance or the friends, right? The others are thinking, it's against me. It makes me nervous, you know? So I'm going to invade Ukraine before these guys expand, right? So realism does explain these feelings of nervousness in very sophisticated ways in what we call security dilemmas. Because, in fact, the dilemma is when you do something to increase your security, the reaction from the others is going to diminish your security, right? It's crazy. So it's like the theory of realism predicts that you're going to be entangled in a strategic situation forever, and there's no way out. So let's look at real data, right? When the United States spends, the United States has a realist strategy. They believe the world is a dangerous place, right? And the governments pursue nuclear weapons and the largest army. You can see it in the amount that the United States spends on weapons is equivalent to all the other 20 countries alone, including China and Russia. And every country spends according to their own possibilities, okay? But China and Russia, as you can see in the second table to the side, right, in this little table to the side, China does increase military spending according to the increase in military spending by the United States. So the security dilemma exists. China feels, or Russia feels, every time the government invests in a new weapon, in a new plane, I'm going to build two. And the same happens, right? The same every time there's, with China and with Russia is the same, right? So China feels more insecure, Russia too, and every time the United States tries to expand the alliances like NATO makes Russia feel insecure. And it causes arms races because if you get a weapon, I'm going to get two. And then the other is going to get three. And I get four. And the other is going to get five. So you see, it causes arm races. And there are, in fact, even nuclear security dilemmas. Because, okay, I'll build one more bomb, one more nuke, right? So I'm going to build 2 nuclear weapons, 3 nuclear weapons, 4 nuclear weapons. And in fact, there are 2 theories of nuclear utilization where people believe that whether you can build as many as you can without considering what the other feels about it. That's the nuclear utilization theory, acronym NUTS, right? Because we're nuts if we think we're going to destroy the planet 400 times. And the other world is the mutually assured destruction, where you have enough weapons to agree to destroy each other mutually. If you attack me, I'll destroy you as well. So it's mutually assured destruction. That's the most stable world. And in fact, after Russia and the United States were able to sign treaties, you can see that after the year 1980, the manufacturing of nuclear warheads stabilized itself, right? And this is precisely to diminish the security dilemmas. Oh, he has more weapons than me. I'll be more. I'll build more, and I'll build more, right? That's so treaties agreements do help to minimize the misperceptions and securities. Now, the other thing that I told you that among the many things that realists predict is that states in a dangerous world will seek alliances, will seek friends, right? You will have to balance the world. Like, you will find, like, if he's too powerful, if he has 20 weapons, I'm going to build 20 weapons or find 20 friends with 1 weapon each. So we balance each other. That's called the balance of power, right? The other thing that they do is distribute risks, because it's very expensive to wage war alone. If I go to war, I'm going to have to pay for it. Or if I have to defend myself, I'll have to carry the burden of all the dead people, all the destruction in my own industries and cities. So I better seek friends, and the attack and the expenses are shared, right? There are many problems with this. The alliances work well, but information is very imperfect, because not all the members pursue the same objectives. For instance, Russia is the main supplier of gas in all of Europe. So if they decide to attack Russia, they will cut the gas supply from them, right? So is the United States, as much as they would want Europe to be fully on their side, I mean, the European countries are going to think twice of where are we going to get the gas, realistically speaking, right? So there's also the information is imperfect, because some generals in the US may be thinking one thing or interpreting one order the other way, and there's a risk for errors, nuclear errors even. If one of them makes a mistake of firing a bullet against a Russian troop or a tank or an airplane, or shut down an airplane, it may well lead to chain ganging. Chain ganging is when one starts the war and the others must follow with no stop. It's like snowballs. That's chain ganging, right? So alliances work very well when faced with a weaker enemy, but with a strong enemy like Russia, not because he's more powerful than the US or wealthier, but it does have nuclear weapons, and those weapons are game changers. So for the United States is playing with fire, Europe is playing with fire, but they're handling very well because they're not escalating. They're using all the diplomatic and economic tools, but they're not using the military directly yet. And they are reluctant. Nobody wants to, there's airplanes, the United States offered airplanes to Ukraine, but nobody wants to give them, because Russia may turn against, or there's this danger of chain ganging, and now we start World War III for sure. So that's the realist, right? That's the realist approach, is very militaristic, right? The real thing, the strategic considerations. Now, The liberal tradition is very old too, but the most recent version, it comes from John Locke, 1760s, and they believe that the world is not that dangerous. After all, we're not fighting wars all the time. People just need to get ahead. Countries like to trade. Countries like to establish networks, diplomacy, treaties, institutions, right? And so for liberals, what avoids war is not strategic considerations, but well-being of the nation. You know, nobody wants to be fighting. Everybody wants to be wealthy. Right? The problem is, as demonstrated by the Ukraine war, is that states do seek power, and states do use their military, even though Russia was trading with Japan and China and Europe, and they had a happy relation of trade, right? It didn't stop Putin to use the military tool, right? So the liberal tradition may not explain the current war because they failed to predict the current war. Trade does not stop. Like conquest does pay off. So, but it will explain the future. How will it explain the future of the war? So if you disconnect Russia from the world economy and you put sanctions, the likelihood is you will decrease their ties to the world, and it won't be more tempted to attack again and attack again to increase its own security. So actually, disconnecting Russia from trade networks and make work worse off in the future than it is paying off during the war. Now, that also is going to throw Russia into the arms of China, right? If the West doesn't want me, if the West doesn't want to trade with me, I'm going to go to China and we'll form a bloc against you all. So, and Russia and China are two formidable enemies that I wonder if the West can easily defeat, and is making the world more dangerous, right? What is for sure is that diplomacy, the diplomatic tool, will not work anymore with either Biden or Putin at the helm. We need to wait like a generation in order for like to sand the rough spots, maybe 2 administrations more, and Putin gone, right? To sand the differences and restart again the relationship. What a liberal would say is, in order to avoid future conflict, right? We could increase cooperation and trade and try to make, say, for instance, in order to have a safe world and prevent war, give Putin a saving phase situation. Don't corner Putin into using nuclear weapons. Instead, offer baits, right? If you don't take over Ukraine, we'll give you this and that, and it works better. That's what a liberal would say in a win-win situations, like non-hegemonic behavior. Hegemonic, it means you behave like a superpower and you want the world to do whatever you want, right? And make it cheap to cooperate. Make it cheap to cooperate, as in Putin will not lose a lot if they start cooperating and talking with Ukraine and maybe retreating the troops, right? But nowadays, Biden, since they cannot attack directly, Biden is playing a war of attrition. So his underground army supplying the Ukrainians with weapons so they can resist for a long time, and therefore Putin's legitimacy and attack will not last, because they know Russia has limited economic resources, right? It's not forever. You cannot sustain those types of debts for a long time. That's the bet. And so a liberal would give a way out in the form of trade or something similar. The third theory that we have, and it's an interpretation, comes from the 1950s, let's say, even though it has traces to Plato, right? But in the 1950s, there was a movement towards questioning the world and questioning the way we talk about power, about relations. Why are women subordinate to males? Why is heterosexual being better than homosexual? Why is that some countries define themselves as superpowers and the others little? You're just talking about it, but it all depends on what your identity is. So even if the state is, if the world is anarchic, even if the world is dangerous, is what you make out of it, right? The states act because they want, if you say you're a loser, you're going to be a loser. If you say you're a winner, that's how you define yourself, and you're going to present yourself that face to the world. The same for countries, right? Countries act by interactions with one another, and their actions are explained by their desires, what they aspire, right? What they believe they are, and that explains the actions of actors. So Russians were in crisis. Their identity as Russians was in crisis. What am I? I was a superpower, but I'm not again. How do I recover my spot? You know, I wish I was in the Cold War again. I wish I was perceived with respect, right? And Putin is very apt to mobilize that feeling among Russians that they miss those days, right? And make them rally around the flag. But it's not necessarily so. Just because you have economic power, military, right? You don't need to be a superpower. Germany is the case. Germany is the wealthiest and most powerful country in Europe. They didn't have a strong military. They didn't behave like superpower, right? Costa Rica, they're a small country surrounded by Nicaragua, for instance, who's barely armed to the teeth, you know? But they decided, no, I'm not going to have an army, you know, just like that. So states decide what they want about anarchy. So what is the predictive power of constructivism? Well, Russia's identity is in crisis. I agree with that theory, right? And there's another part of the theory that I like, which is an argument that they made that today it is unacceptable to take over other countries' territory. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, everybody agreed to go and defend Kuwait in the 90s, right? Now that Saddam is Putin is invading Ukraine, everybody's in arms, up in arms, right? So this is called the territorial integrity norm. Nobody is allowed to make changes in maps unless it's agreed by the people. In fact, Biden asked if the separatist parts of Ukraine are going to separate, let the people vote and decide, right? Do not invade and change the maps by yourself. So in conclusion, right, realists are very pessimistic of what's going to happen, and they predict more conflict. So we're going to maybe have a nuclear war, maybe a tripolar world with China, Russia, and Europe and the US on the other side, right? We don't have that knowledge because it all depends on the future. Now they're in talks, so I don't know the outcome of the war. Most likely we're not going to go to World War III, I hope, because Russia and Europe is ready to end the war. That's what it is. And it's not about Ukraine. The war is not about Ukraine. The war is about the role of Russia and the US as superpowers. That's the reality. Now, liberals believe that we can save ourselves if we integrate Russia into the democracy, respect of human rights discourse, and start cooperating with Russia to insert it again in the international system. And constructivists believe that dialogue and their interpretation of Europe, maybe to include Russians. Russians are, at least Western Russia, is very European, but Russians define themselves a little bit apart, and the idea of Europe does not include Russia as part of Europe, you know? So maybe we change the discourses around the narrative of what European is. Does it include Russia, only Rus that gives, right? Or it expands all the way to Siberia and the eastern part of Russia. That's a debate that has to come, according to the constructivists, for a solution. Now, this is my bibliography. If anybody wants it, I can send it to you. These are my main books in IR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saenz Rivera. Maybe we could also, I know James was going to go ahead and post his presentation in the chat, and maybe we could ask you to as well. So we're ready for our third presenter. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Young Park. Dr. Young Park, he is going to be talking about the conflict in Ukraine and the state of democracy around the world. So welcome, Dr. Park, and we're excited to hear from you.
All right, thank you, Amber, and then good evening, everybody. It's time to getting hungry, but I'd like to share with my PowerPoints at this time. I hope that you can see my PowerPoints. The first presenter, James, provide the background information of Ukraine and Ukraine war, and the second presenter, the Dr. Sergio, provide the theoretical tools to analyze what's going on in Ukraine war. I'm talking about a little bit different, but it's the same. I mean, basically the same thing, but a little bit different approach. Try to getting some lessons from this Ukraine war, even though it is an ongoing thing at this time. So my title is The Conflict in Ukraine and the State of Democracy Around the World. So it's basically I like to talk about the democracies and what democracy is and so on and so forth. But this, one of the pickets for the people holding during the protest against this war said that the Save Ukraine today equals Save world tomorrow. What kind of world tomorrow we are talking to? Obviously, it's not the authoritarian regime's kind of word, or the Putin's word, or the Xi Jinping's word, or the Kim Jong-un's word. It certainly is not. This kind of save the world tomorrow means that we like to live in the democratic systems, which provide much more prosperity, peace, and then more liberty, freedom, and so on and so forth. So there is another theories. Another theory said that the among the democratic countries, they are less likely to engage in the armed conflict. So that's what we call the democratic peace theory. Very interesting theory. It has a lot of problem, of course, but it's also very interesting. Democracy are hesitant to engage in armed conflict with other identified democracies. So that's the pretty good, simple summary of the theories. Basically, among the democratic countries, they don't fight. That's what that means. How? Because in democratic countries, nations will try to follow the same norms of conflict that characterize their domestic political process. We have a lot of differences, lots of conflict domestically, but how do we solve that problem? Through the discussion, through the negotiation. We don't kill each other. We have a Congress, we have an interest group, we have so many other political institutions, and then to bring all those issues and then discuss, talking about it, try to understand each other, sometimes not, but so by doing so, we try to solve the conflict, among us. And then the court is obviously the last resort. And then we expected the decision maker in other nations to do the same thing because they are the same democratic country. Thus, when the democratic country face each other and they have a conflict each other, then we expected to resolve the dispute through the compromise and non-violence way, just the same way that we resolve the conflict domestically. So same norms and same procedures, democratic procedures that works in the domestically also applies in the international conflict situation. That's what the theory is talking about. So if we recall 20th centuries when the democracy is fully developed, not entirely, but kind of enough level of democracy is achieved, then we do not remember any war between two democratic countries. Obviously, there is a problem to define the democratic countries. What constitutes the democratic countries? That's the questions. The Mexico is a democratic country. United States is a democratic country. The German, Italy, they are the democratic country. There is a lot of countries that are in the process of democratizing, and then some people already fully developed, but it has a lot of problems, and so forth. So defining the democracy is going to be a challenge in the theories, of course, and it makes a lot of people confused. Well, there is no direct way or the complete way to measure the democracies of one country. But one of the things that widely used among the scholars and among the journalists is the democracy index published by the Economist Intelligence Unit. It is the same company of the journal Economist. And then they ask the 60 questions in five categories. Try to measure this democratic index of one country: electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, functioning of government, political participation, and political culture. Those are the 5 categories to measure the level of democracy of one country. Obviously, there are different opinions to measure the level of democracy, but at this time we try to use this one. Interestingly enough, that the democracy index can categorize the
Dr. Park,
Dr.
you just
Park.
muted yourself. You're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
From the beginning?
Not from the beginning, just about 10, 20 seconds ago, you muted yourself.
Oh, so I didn't do that one though. Interesting.
10
Still,
seconds,
can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So say that again, then the democracy index, according to this democracy index, there are 4 different levels of regimes: full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regime, and authoritarian regimes. And in the full democracy, Norway, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth, there are about 21 countries that categorized as a full democratic countries. The United States used to be the full democratic country, but unfortunately we degraded. So now we belongs to the flawed democracies, and just like France, Spain, and the other countries. About 54 countries categorized as a flawed democracies, and then these countries has a basic democratic process and democratic institution. However, so time to time we find some problems on those institutions and the process, like free, fair election kind of things. Hybrid regimes, Mexico, Hong Kong is a kind of example. There are about 34 countries identified as a hybrid regime according to this democracy index. And in these countries, the democratic system or the democratic institutions can be found more the problems of the democratic institution, like a free and fair election kind of things, or the corruptions. It can be found more systematically, more frequently. So it says hybrid regimes. Authoritarian regimes, 58 countries identify as an authoritarian regime. Basically, there is no full liberties or the freedoms of the people, and then obviously the government try to control almost everything. So it's cannot say that it is a democratic country. So these are the 4 regime, the 4 different type of regime according to this democracy index. And then the 2020, the global democracy has a very bad year, means that the overall democracy index declined. But pandemic could be the one reason, and an additional reason, but it has a historical trend, in fact. So if you look at the maps, then these are the hybrid regimes or the authoritarian regimes. And then there's a fully democratic countries, only a few of them, not many of them. And then there is a flawed democracies, couple of there. So we are very lucky actually to live in the democratic country. So more than half not more than half, is almost 2/3 of the world population lives in non-democratic countries. And then if you review this democracy index more historically, then from 2006 to 2021, in those 15 years, democracy index of 98 countries out of 167 countries has been decreased. That's about the 58%. Among the full democracy countries, 11 out of 21 countries, their index level declines. And then among the flawed democracies, the 62%, hybrid regimes about 47%, authoritarian regimes about 63%. So this is the general trend of the nation in the last 2 decades, 2-3 decades, that the democracy index is continuously declined, so that the countries are more moving toward the less democratic country, and then they maintain a less democratic institution or the systems, and then operating their politics in a non-democratic way. United States is not an exception. So when this is the fully democratic country, I just take 2 countries, and in the 2006 and 2011, those are the index. So it's New Zealand, for example, number 2 according to the 2021 index, and their democracy index actually increased compared to the 2006. Good for them. But the UK declines. Among the flawed democracies, like the United States, continuously declines. The France is kind of fluctuating, but overall it's not improves, it rather declines. Hybrid regimes, there's also the Mexico and Ukraine. They are also, general trend is a declines. And in the authoritarian regime, they start very low, but they also declines too. China is turns to a very authoritarian state, just like Russia too, continuously declines. So imagine that Russia is a democratic country, not an authoritarian country. Putin Putin has been a president of the Russia for 22 years as of today. So then he's getting he's becoming a more and more authoritarian leaders. Imagine that, and then suppose assuming that Russia is not an authoritarian country, but a democratic country, and then they have a problem with the Ukraine. Then what kind of solutions, what kind of efforts will be given to resolve those conflicts? Probably it's not going to be the war, most likely. That's what the theory says. And then the more and more countries are less democratic countries, and then employ the more less democratic institution or the democratic operation in there domestically, so that there is a growing tensions among the countries even. That's why we have some, problems and then high tensions from time to time when we see the world news. So, if the democracy, every country achieved the democracies, assuming it, and so let's assume that, then can we get a permanent peace? So is democracy a complete and absolute solution for the permanent peace? The answer is no, obviously. Winston Churchill is in 1947 said left a very famous quote about the democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Little confused, but basically it says that the democracy is not a complete and the best one. However, so far, the best one among the system that we, the human being, actually tried. So it is not the best one, but so far it is the best one. So this democratic system is a very fragile the political system, in fact. But however, we can make it much stronger. So there is a free and fair election concerns all the times, freedom of press, obviously misinformations, that's very serious problems. Rule of law should be kept all the times. The populist leader, we should avoid them and we should be a little bit careful of them, and so on and so forth. So lots of problems in the democratic system. So the democratic country could fight each other too. Democratic country could have a war, but the chance is much lesser. It's like that, there is only one candy, and then 3 years, boys and girls, try to get one, then they probably fight. They don't know what kind of what negotiation means, what compromise means, and then other ways to resolve the conflict. But when your time when you grown up, and then the more educated, and then know how to deal with this kind of problem without without engaging in the violent way, then they can split the candy by two so that they can share it. They could find another ways to resolve the conflict in a peaceful way. So that's the kind of metaphor of the democracies. Is if we, the grown-up, then there is a less chance to fight. Obviously, the grown-ups fight each other's too. There is a physical fightings too, but the chances are much lesser compared to the younger people who do not fully understand about the peaceful, the resolution kind of things. So what should we done? What should be done? I mean, when we look at the Ukraine war, which was probably the biggest war since the World War II, then what kind of lesson we could get? Obviously, the democracy is probably, arguably, the best way to prevent any armed conflict, which was the disaster for everybody's really. Nobody gets it's not a win-win situation, obviously. So what are you gonna do then? So democracy obviously is not the complete solution to avoid all kind of armed conflict, but probably the best way at this time. So if we imply the realism in realism theory or the liberal theories, whatever it is, if we put every efforts individually to make a democracy more strong in my country, in their countries, then eventually the whole world is moving toward a more peaceful, the peaceful society, peaceful world, peaceful earth. But what are you gonna do? That's the question, and that is the big homework for everybody, because the democracy is not simple things. It's a very complicated one, and it takes lots of patience to achieve the desirable level of democracies, and then it requires everybody's participation. So if there are students out there, and if you took already the government 2305 or 2306 class, then congratulations. But if you are taking now, then you are in the right times. And if you don't take it right now, then it's required, so you should take it. But everybody, welcome to the government 2305 classes and 2306 classes. It's the important matter to understand the democracy, and then to do the small things, small parts that I can do for the world pieces. So just a small step, but the one giant leap probably. So that's my presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Park. We really appreciate your time tonight, Dr. Saenz Rivera's time tonight, as well as Instructor Stepp's time tonight. At this time, we'd like to take questions from you. You have an opportunity to put the questions in the chat. You have an opportunity to raise your hand. And before we do that, I would like to, because I know, it's kind of at the end of the evening, I wanted to take an opportunity to just thank some people who made this possible tonight. First of all of the students that came, very, very grateful to you. I know that, often you get points for this, but time is very valuable. So thank you for coming, as well as our government faculty for your support and efforts in terms of continuous encouragement. And as always, I'd like to thank our Dean, Susana Rodarte, for her effortless and timeless support of all of her faculty. So thank you, Dean Rodarte, on behalf of all of us. And so if there's questions, we'd love to hear from you tonight. It was a lot of information, a lot of very rich information, very valuable too, just in terms of the timeliness of what's happening around the world. So if you have questions, comments even, we'd love to hear from you. Dr. Saenz Rivera will kind of take hold of that chat. And if there's questions that you have, or like I said, in the Teams window, there's an opportunity to raise your hand. If you'd like to just turn on your mic and ask a question of either Dr. Saenz Rivera, Dr. Park, or Instructor Stepp, we'd love to hear from you tonight. All of the information, I think, was just wonderful, only because it had this kind of linear fashion where James started with the beginning, and then of course Sergio incorporating all the theories, and then really the big question that Dr. Park posed was the state of democracy. Where are we at? Where are we going? So thank all of you for taking the time to put this together in the continued series of Building El Paso Strong, which Government Discipline is very proud of, and Dr. Saenz Rivera is the founder of that. So questions? I think we do see a hand up. Dr. Saenz Rivera?
You're muted.
Sergio, you got your mute on?
I cannot read the chat because I'm a guest. Unfortunately, I don't know what I did. So I cannot read chat, but I can listen to microphones. Bob or Eileen?
Yeah, hi. My name is Bob Nosbish. I'm a lecturer in the government discipline. And first, I want to thank you all for wonderful presentations. My question is for you, Dr. Sergio, regarding predictions. There is one European leader who has not come out to condemn President Putin's actions, and this is Viktor Orban of Hungary, because Hungary, as you stated earlier, is one of those nations that depends heavily on gas from Russia. What is your prognostication as far as what Mr. Orban will do, if he will continue this fence sitting, or if he will go one way or the other in either criticizing Putin for his actions or the other way around?
International relations is pretty much a discipline that focuses on the superpowers, because it depends on the superpowers' behavior of how the others behave. And little powers have little choice in the world. And this is the realist speaking of me, right? I'm being a realist right now. And for Hungary, it's a neighbor of Russia. It's a neighbor of Ukraine and Belarus too. Belarus is the other country that from Europe that hasn't spoken too, because they're afraid of Russia. Remember that international relations are not just the here and now, but the future. They must think strategically of what's convenient for them in the future. Orban and Hungary, and in fact, most of Europe depend on Russian gas and Russian goodwill. And even Hungary was a traditional part of the sphere of Russia. And Orban and Putin are both nationalists, like they love their own countries and they're willing to mobilize their electorates around the flag. So they do nationalist things. So there's a mutual admiration, perhaps, from Orban and Putin. There's strategic considerations. So Hungary doesn't have much of a choice. They will sit behind and bandwagon. You know, they join the bandwagon. If Russia loses, maybe eventually Hungary will join Europe. Oh, you see, I was alongside of you all the time, you know. But if Russia wins, I was the only one that didn't support the condemnation and the economic sanctions and all that. So little powers have very little choice. That's what I predict.
We have also a question from Eileen. I think she was first, Pastorina. Eileen, can you turn your mic on for us?
Eileen.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hello.
Is there's gonna be an essay? Ray, introduction is gonna be an essay about Europeans.
Is this a question for one of your instructors?
Yeah,
Eileen?
from the essay, I have to write an essay about the war.
Okay. And who is your instructor? I'm sorry, Eileen, I didn't catch it.
Oh, sorry. I'm just a student from Community College.
But is there one of your professors sent you here, right, for the presentation to write about it?
Yeah, from Dr. Hold on.
And then I see you, Elizabeth. I'll get to your question in just a second.
Hold up.
That's okay. Take your time, Arlene.
This instructor name, I forgot his name. Mr. David Riley.
Okay, I think Mr. Riley's from history, so I'm not quite sure exactly. I'm hoping maybe you can just touch base with him on exactly what he wants you to write. Also,
Yeah.
just FYI, you see the presentations that were also posted in the chat, if that might be helpful to you, Eileen. But maybe ask Instructor Riley or if he, the directive, because I'm not sure, and I apologize.
It's okay. I just
Okay.
want to let you know.
Thank
I
you.
know it's gonna talk about the war in
Okay.
New Orleans where it happened, but I understand I did record it or taking notes the best I can. Because
No, thank you for coming. We're really grateful. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I think you were next. If you want to unmute your mic and perhaps pose a question.
My name is Elizabeth Gomez. I'm from Andrews High School. I'm currently taking government with Ms. Bustillos. She's the proctor for the EPCC dual credit. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for the very rich information. You guys gave a really, really in-depth presentation. And then my question for you guys, I don't know if it's a little simplistic, but are we heading towards a nuclear war if we were to join Ukraine?
Let me, if I can give that question to Dr. Park, and no question is ever too simple, too complex. All your questions are always welcome. So thank you for that.
Okie dokie, thank you.
Yeah, the nuclear words that everybody's concerned, so everybody worry about it. From the realistic perspectives that the nuclear weapons is not designed to use, it's designed to deter the other people's actions, because it has so much strong destruction power. So Russia, Putin's, even though I don't know he's really crazy or not, but anyhow, even though he wants to use it, then it's gonna be lots of hesitations, because if he uses it, then there will be a significant response from the NATO and from the United States, obviously. There is a lot of people say that the Putin could use not a massive, the nuclear weapons, but the small scale of nuclear weapons. And then what kind of response from the United States he's gonna get? That's again another question. But my guess, well, everybody has a different guess, but my simple guess is that it's very difficult for him to use the nuclear weapons, unless that's gonna be his last options. So just like North Korea.
Remember, they have to use the tools, right?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
you start with diplomacy, then you escalate it to economics, and then you use the military weapons, and then the nuclear weapons. Is
really the last resort. And then, like I said, according to the international theory, the nuclear weapon is not designed to use. It's designed to deter the other people, kind of make a threat, the other people, to come up to the discussion table and so on and so forth. But who knows? We'll keep in watch.
I think our next question is coming from Alexa Mora. Ms. Mora, can you turn your mic on for me? And let's see if we can get your question in.
Hi, I'm Alexa.
Hi.
And you were saying right now that the presentations were gonna be in the chat, but like I don't think the chat is available to all the guests. So where would they be?
Okay. I'll go ahead and ask James if he can look at that, so you can. I saw the presentation when I was in the chat just a little bit earlier, but let's make sure that if you have access to all of it. Thank you. I appreciate it. We won't go unless you have access to it. Okay, so okay, our next question I think is from Carla. Ms. Mata, can you unmute your mic?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was about to raise my hand because I had the same. It wasn't a question. It was the same comment as a lady that just went right now. I don't have access to the chat either.
Okay, we'll look into it. Okay, we won't go unless you have access to it. And then Christian Rocha. And if it's anything related to what we just talked about in terms of the chat, we'll go ahead and get those presentations accessible for you. So you can, put your hands down, but if it's a question related to the presentation, we'll kind of multitask at the same time, okay?
Amber?
And then Christian? Can you unmute your mic? Do you have a question? What about Lizeth? Lizeth, did you have a question?
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
Can you adjust your volume just a tad? I heard it, but it just seemed.
Yeah, it might be my laptop.
Okay, I think we're good now.
Okay. I'm a professor. I'm a student of Professor Stepp. And my question was, if it were to become something nuclear, does El Paso have any shelters in place for the civilians?
And that's for Mr. Stepp.
It doesn't have to be him. I just wanted to state that.
Okay, I just wanted to give it to him only because I was trying to make my rounds.
Okay. So as to El Paso being a target, Fort Bliss is a target because it has the Patriot missile system as well as some other combat forces. But when it comes to shelters and so on, there's not really a lot. And I would say the chances of that actually being a concern that we have to worry about are low, thankfully. But when you look at old buildings, like for example, I know Coronado High School, they tended to be built with fallout shelters, but thankfully it's been decades since that's been a real concern. And I would say that you don't need to worry too much about it. There isn't really a huge infrastructure in place when it comes to these shelters, fallout shelters, but the chances are very low that this would be a problem.
Thank you for your question. Emma, I think you're next in line. Do you have a question for one of our presenters? If you can unmute your mic, please. James, at the same time, I don't know if you're able to ensure that we have the presentations accessible to all the students?
Yeah, so if you signed in as a guest, you don't have access to the chat, but what I'll go ahead and say right now is that I will send out the presentation if you don't have access to the chat. My email, if you want to write it down, is jstepp@epcc.edu, and just go ahead and email me. Once again, that's jstepp@epcc.edu, and I'll send you my presentation as well as the others. I'll get a copy of their PowerPoint slides. Thank you.
Emma, did you have a question? If you want to unmute your mic.
Is it me? Hopefully you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Great. So I'm a student at El Paso Community College, Trans Mountain campus. My name is Emmanuel Sanchez, and I just had a question that just sprung up as soon as I forgot which one of you mentioned something about the economic balance, things that relations between the countries, right? As we know, Russia's having a hard time. I'll say passing through Ukraine, trying to, I guess, fight to push, right? Something. So apparently, they're having a hard. How can I say this? They're just having a delay as not as planned when moving towards the borders and passing more from that point on. Also, economically, they're obviously being shut off, or the trades are being cut off from other countries, right? And recently, I saw a little bit of research I did a few days ago. I saw that they were, I guess, a lot of workers are getting off from the job because of losses of, like jobs like, for example, McDonald's, things from other countries, they're just getting shut down because of this issue, right? What I'm here to ask is mainly what could be possibly the theory, or how can I say, assumption of end game for Russia internally, morally. What's gonna be for them? Perfect.
I'll go ahead and give that question to Dr. Sainz Rivera. Thank you, Emmanuel, and my apologies. I said Emma, my apologies.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I had to figure it out.
Emmanuel, I'm astounded and astonished by the pertinence of your question. It's a really good question. I love when my students go do research. I wish I had you in my classroom. You're a model student already. So having said that, let me tell you that what is the end game? As long as Putin has the power, there is no end game. Putin's game is to finish the war as soon as possible, not to capture the entire Ukraine, but go into such a position of force that in the table of negotiations is his word or nothing, you know? Yeah, there are losses. I've also watched videos and travel logs about Russians, how they're doing there. But you gotta also understand that Russia produces a lot of its own stuff. Russia is autonomous in its own manufacturing. The fact that they don't have McDonald's doesn't really affect them. There are a few jobs losses. There's a lot of brands that can substitute that. Yeah, there's gonna be losses, obviously, in connectivity. What's gonna hurt them is the banking stuff. There's banking sanctions. But even then, you know, if you save in rubles and all your economic transactions are in the coin of Russia, and you don't have much connections abroad, you're not hurt because the value of the coin. What is going to hurt is on imports and exports. But let me tell you one thing. The one thing that Biden hasn't been able to touch is precisely the gas, because the gas supply supplies all of Europe. And so Europe is dependent on that gas. They cannot cut it off. So Russia, while it's receiving all these economic sanctions, there's one funnel of a windfall of money because gas prices went up, right? So Putin is still receiving a lot of money coming in from the gas alone, not to mention investments, not to mention all these offshore like secret accounts that where they can launder money. And you know, there's so many avenues in this globalized economy that is really hard to really bend Russia. Russia is not a superpower yet, but it is pretty amazing power, right? Like it's not an easy enemy to defeat. So it can go a long way, the war.
Right.
Thank you for that question. I think we're up. The next in line is Joycelyn. Joycelyn, if you can unmute your mic, and I believe you may have a question for us.
Jocelyn.
Hi, good evening. My name is Jocelyn Malanche, and I have two questions, but my first one is, what do you think other countries have not intervened?
Okay, if I can give that question to Dr. Park, please.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, why do you think other countries have not intervened?
Why? I mean, the other countries not intervene in this Ukraine war?
Yes.
Why? That's the question.
Yeah, why?
Okay. Well, so for our President Biden, his position was very clear even before the war begins. So he's not going to want to send the troops to the other countries to defend the other countries unless it is our allies. And then the Ukraine is not our allies at this time. We promised to protect their sovereignty many years ago, as James' presentation mentioned. However, it was not a treaty, a defense treaty or the alliance. So that's why the Ukraine wants to join the NATO in order to secure the automatic involvement from the other countries to protect their securities. But President Biden is very clear that he's not going to want to send the troops to the other country unless these are allies, and also he doesn't want to, direct conflict with the Soviet Union. Not the Soviet Union. Well, I reveal my ages, I guess. But Russia doesn't want to direct conflict with Russia. That means almost virtually a third world war, because these are the two superpower countries, and in the enormous, war fires if they directly conflict. And then obviously the Biden doesn't want to do that. And then the many of European countries will also worry about the Third World War. Okay? No one wants to expansion of the war. So they try to restrain the war within the Ukraine. I'm sorry to say to the Ukraine, but that's the hardcore fact, like a realistic politics, based on the realism. That's what it is. I think.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Jocelyn, for that question. Jorge, I think you may be next. If you can unmute your mic, you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm trying to write my question down because it was a little bit complex, but so in regards to when we talk about superpowers versus little powers, and we talked about how there's almost this unspoken rule that these powers won't invade other countries. My question is regarding the displacement of people. For example, like in Serbia, their people are leaving their country at a high percentage, and their birth rate is also declining. So my question is, for countries like Serbia, of course, will their displacement of people cause other countries like Russia to invade as well?
Okay, I'll give that to James.
Yeah, so when looking at the migration issue, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the United States is included in this. We all have had demographic decline, lowering birth rates. When it comes to the Ukrainians, you're seeing many more countries be open to take in Ukrainians than perhaps you saw with Syrians and so on. And there are of course implications of that. But when it comes to specifically Russia invading countries that take in migrants from Ukraine, or refugees is probably the better term for this, that's unlikely. So Russia's already bitten off more than it could probably chew at this point. It's suffering immense casualties, regardless of whether the Ukrainian government's actual numbers are correct or not. It's quite clear to see that Russia already is having its military taxed, if not to the limit, at least close. So I would say that it's very unlikely at this point that Russia would want to expand the war into another country. The only possibility is that when explaining to the domestic population why a country like Ukraine has, if not defeated, at least put to a standstill the Russian military, there will definitely be some. I would say there would probably be some propaganda that will come out domestically from Russia, the Russian government, that NATO is more involved than perhaps it is. Basically, it's kind of embarrassing for them to be defeated by, or if not defeated, right, put to a standstill by what was considered up until like a month ago a third-rate military power, whereas Russia proudly calls itself the second strongest military in the world, and quite frankly, their performance has not been all that great.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jorge. Josue, I think you may be up next, and then we have one more presenter, and we're probably at about time. Josue, if you can unmute your mic. Thank you, Jorge.
Hi, are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, this is a question for all three of them, and they can answer it. It's more like a theory, I guess, or if you guys like the outcome or the effect of the conflict between Ukraine and the relationships between other countries that are involved. My question would be what do you guys think would be the effect of all of this between the conflict of the Ukraine and Russia?
Okay. Dr. Saenz Rivera, I don't know if you need more clarification or.
I do need a little bit more clarification. What would be the, as I understood, what would be about the relationship or the outcome of this war, right? That's what you mentioned. Well, I believe that Russia, despite the setbacks, is going to win. I mean, there's no, I mean, the United States took 6 weeks to take Fallujah. Fallujah is a little town. With all the powers and alliances and tanks that the U.S. and the use of airplanes, it took 6 weeks to take Fallujah. Russia is taking a territory and cities much, much larger than Fallujah with a more limited military, and they haven't used yet their aviation. They have been reluctant to use airplanes because they wanted to prevent escalation of civilian loss and probably the involvement of other countries, you know? So that's my prediction, that it's gonna win. Putin is certainly gonna be undermined in the phase that in order to increase his security, he's gonna end up defeated in the political and diplomatic world, you see? So maybe he will win the war militarily, but in economic terms, it's going to take a long time to reconnect Russia with all these trade networks, with the trust, with panels of scientists, technical cooperation, hard to invite artists, even ballet performance companies were suffering because of the ban on Russian performers. So it's going to take a long time. So I believe that Putin lost in finding his place around the superpowers of the world. I believe that Russia lost more. I was disagreeing with James. I think that Russia is going to win despite the setbacks. but I think it's going to arrive very diminished in prestige and stature. And so I don't know what he wants. The other nations hopefully will not get involved. Let's pray for that. Because if they do get involved, that means we are in World War III.
Thank you. And I think maybe our last question is coming from Marco. Marco, do you have a question? We have some more hands up. Dr. Saenz Rivera, let me ask you, we have some hands up. We want to get through them all, right? Or
Sure.
Okay,
I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, Marco, can you unmute yourself? I think you may have a question, and I'll give it to Dr. Park.
Hello, this is Marco Mendoza from UPCC. Well, I have a question right now. Well, right now I'm so into sports, and specifically soccer. And well, what do you think about the discrimination that's happening to Russians living outside from their country? Like, for example, in Chelsea Football Club, the owner is a Russian migrant, I think, and like he got sanctioned by freezing his bank accounts. So that's what I'm referring to.
But that's a very interesting questions, really. I mean, the war, when the war happens, then all the cost, the transfer to the ordinary people, in fact. And then there's right now at this time, all Russians who lives in outside of Russia is not going to be treated very well, at least. Yeah, maybe there is a system. Probably there is no, the prisoners camp that the United States had against the Japanese during the Second World War. We're not gonna see that kind of things. However, obviously the people, Putin, obviously clearly identified who he is and what he wants and then what kind of things he can do. And then he is the president of Russia, so he represents Russia, and then the cost will bear to the Russian people. So that's very unfortunate, but that's what is going to happen during the wartime. Obviously, we don't want any systematic or the harsh discrimination against these innocent people, but there is always the innocent victims during the wartime. Yes.
I know a little bit about the case because the person who owns the Chelsea team is the Chelsea or Chelsea is one of Putin's childhood friends. That's why they targeted him. So they're not targeting all the wealthy people, but the oligarchs, the ones that are very close to Putin's circle.
That's right.
So
That's a very good point. Actually, that's kind of indirectly give a pressure to the Putin through this oligarchy, so to speak. The super rich people who turns to be a super rich because of the Putin's close relationships. So many Western countries give sanctions to those people, but so also the innocent peoples, ordinary peoples, also got some the innocent victims, unfortunately.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. And I believe, Melissa, you're up. If you can unmute your mic, and I think instructor Step will be ready. Are you still with us, Melissa? And perhaps maybe you're having problems with your mic. Let me come back to you if you don't mind, and I'll jump. And Francisco, do you have a question? You can unmute your mic and I'll come back, Melissa. Maybe it's perhaps a technical problem.
I just had a question. I see the United States is taking Ukraine refugees, and I was just wondering if the United States will ever go so far as in taking Russian refugees.
James?
Yes, the United States does take in Russian dissidents, refugees. Right now, there are quite a few Russians that are leaving Russia and heading over into Western Europe. And I was watching a news program on this, actually on the DW, which is a German news channel. Highly recommend that. Anyways, there's quite a lot of concern because you have people moving from or leaving Russia because you can be imprisoned, and there are plenty of people being imprisoned for imposing this war. And so that is, the United States has a policy that if you can show that your government is targeting you like that, then you can apply for asylum. Not just the United States, but many countries have this policy. So yes, the United States would and does take in Russian refugees.
Thank you. Melissa, I wanted to jump back with you and see perhaps if we can get your mic on. And we could always, Melissa, if you're having problems with your mic, James is monitoring the chat. You can chat, and at the same time, let me jump to Jorge. Jorge, if you can turn on your mic, I believe you had a question.
Yes, one more.
That's okay.
So, we've all seen, Brittany Griner, the WNBA player, imprisoned by Russia for the marijuana pen. So, my question now is, if we think future forward, would we impose more sanctions in the sense of, there are, I know this is kind of like out of subject, but there were drag queens, American drag queens that were also arrested in Russia, flying into Moscow. So would we, because I know kind of flights are already like staying out of that Russian air zone, do you see that as like a future like thing that could be permanent in the sense of basically us staying out of those countries that don't follow our ideals in a sense?
I'll give that to Dr. Park.
That's another interesting question. I mean, I always think about the effectiveness of sanctions. If we have if the United States has a problem with Great Britain, let's say that, and then they give economic sanctions, then it's gonna be a serious problem because considering the economic ties and the volumes, trade volumes, and so on and so forth. And more than that, the Great Britain's UK government do care about their people, so that they will come up to the negotiation. But the people like the leaders like Putin or the North Korea Kim Jong-un, they really don't care much about their peoples or the economy. Okay? They are more prone for their political goals or the political ambitions kind of things. So to give sanctions to the Russia does not really much effective to change the Putin's mind, probably. So that's the why the United States give a sanction to the oligarchy, the super rich people, the Putin's good friends, so that if they have a direct impact of these sanctions, then they're gonna give a pressure to the Putins to stop the war or to change their minds. So that's kind of indirect one. So the sanction is effectiveness of sanction is kind of interesting, especially against the authoritarian countries like Russia. And then one of the very important things I think is that how long the Western countries' collaboration to give this sanction, collective sanction, will last. That's another big question. During the wartime, obviously the Western country will collaborate each other, will work collectively against Russia, but somehow the war ended. Then how long this sanction will go as a collectively? As in the collective sanction goes. That's the big question. If it lasts longer than we thought, then that will be a real punishment to the Russia and the Putins. But if one country, other country, like Sergio said, that they are really dependent on the Russia's gas and oil, so that the Germans said that the Germans deviate from these collective actions, collective sanctions. France deviate these collective sanctions. Then the United States effort, could be diminished.
Okay.
So that's interesting things about the effectiveness of sanctions.
Okay.
Thank you.
James, I'm sorry. I know you don't have to raise your hand, James.
Well, I just wanted to share that there was a question in the chat here. So, beyond the use of tactical nukes, what should the diplomatic response be for the use of chemical or biological weapons by Russia in Ukraine?
James, can you take that on?
Okay. Sorry, dogs are having a bit of a wrestle in the background, but so this would be a clear turning point in history. If Russia uses WMDs in Ukraine, the United States, as well as the world, really needs to take a firm stand and condemn this behavior and take as much action up until actually entering into the conflict that they can. So we don't have a lot more wiggle room when it comes to sanctions, but there is, of course, the oil and gas. And if there's a WMD used in Ukraine by the Russians, you would hope that the Western Europeans would be willing to go without oil and gas imports from Russia for a time at least. But you can't allow this kind of precedent to be set. This would be the antithesis of everything that the United States has worked for since World War II, which is creating a rules-based international order and allowing a great power to essentially ignore every rule in the book and commit even more egregious war crimes that they've already committing is just not acceptable. So I would hope that the reaction would be very strong.
Thank you. And then Melissa, I'll give you one last opportunity. We're going to go ahead and close out for tonight. But please, if you have your mic ready to go, we're ready for the question. Okay. Is that in the chat, James? By any chance?
No, there was only one question.
Okay. Okay. Alrighty. Well, then, again, thank you for tonight. Any last parting words, presenters, before we close out?
See, it's a matter of principle whether we're gonna stop Russia or not. As the U.S. talking like the U.S., right? It's a matter of principle. It's a war. Are you gonna let them rise? Are you gonna allow another superpower to emerge? That's why the war is not really about Ukraine. It's about the status of Russia and the status of can the U.S. really become again the respected superpower that mobilized the world, or is it gonna stand back and let the Europeans fight their own wars? Because that's the big issue. It's not Russia, it's really China, right? So if we don't act now and prevent Russia's rise, we may not have allies for our conflict with China? That's the moral question, right? And the launch for the future. So that's my
Yes.
conclusion.
I'd like to echo with that. And then the United States has to be very careful to give not to give a wrong message to the many other authoritarian countries like China or the other authoritarian countries too. So this is not only the Ukraine matters. It is our matters really. The world matters really. Even though it happens, several thousand miles away, still it is the United States matter. It is our matters. So that's why we need to pay attention on this, the world.
And then James, anything else?
I agree with both my prior colleagues here. This is really a moral question for the world. We're at a turning point in history where you're seeing whether this rules-based system can work, whether it's strong enough, or whether it's going to bend essentially to Russia and to other great powers potentially that could get involved. Not necessarily in Ukraine, but China, for example, has made it pretty clear that they're going to consider invading Taiwan. So this, of course, the amount of strength, the amount of energy that's put behind fighting Russia, using sanctions and diplomacy, is a real important sign to China as well, not to make the same mistake.
Okay. Well, let me then remind you that Teams has a feature where we can take attendance. So I'll run those reports. If for any reason there's problems with, an instructor who sent you here, the thing that I always do is while I'm on, I just take a quick screenshot just to verify plan 2 if something goes wrong. We want to thank you again for coming to the series, Building El Paso Strong on the Ukraine. Thank you to Dr. Park. Thank you to Dr. Saenz Rivera. Thank you to Instructor James Stepp for tonight. It was an amazing evening. The questions were phenomenal. And like Sergio says, we're always very proud of our students and the thoughtful questions that you think about and that you're able to convey to us. So good night, everyone, and thank you again. If for any reason something goes wrong, you have the flyer, reach out to me. You can always search my name at EPCC. Let me help you. Let me, if you need anything in terms of verification, you just let us know, okay? And my best to you. Thank you for everything.